Hey, everybody. We're going to try a new segment here. We're basically just having discussions about larger concepts, and maybe eventually we'll get into the smaller ones, but large concepts about tabletop role playing. We're probably going to frame it from D&D 5e as everything kind of goes that way for right now. Just because that's, one, that's the big game, and two, it's what I'm super passionate about right now, and most likely, as you'll see with Victor, he's at least somewhat passionate about 5e in specific. But this time, we're going to talk about something that's been on both of our minds for a little bit now, which is the conversation between theater of the mind and being on the grid when it comes to combat. I think Victor doesn't really have a personal preference as of yet. He's somewhat in the middle, whereas in myself, as of late, I've been leaning more and more and more so to theater of the mind as time goes on. So, hey, Victor, what's up? You want to say anything and whatnot?
Yeah. Hello. But yeah, I am indeed passionate about 5e more so than any other TTRPG. Really. And that's not just because I haven't played all of them. That's most of the ones I have played. I still prefer D&D.
Yeah.
But yeah, the specifically 5e. But on the whole, grid versus theater of the mind, I find myself being torn between different positions on this because, on the one hand, to me, mechanics are a support for story, and that's really what it often boils down to in many of these questions. That is it about the story or is it about the game? And the way I see it, I want it all to be about the story. That all the various pillars are there, all other elements and pillars are there to support and enhance the story. But at the same time, I haven't been comfortable myself using theater of the mind too much, and there's a few reasons for that. And I've started reflecting closer on them lately. But originally, I just sort of went for grid maps and such myself because that seemed it seemed logical. It seemed what made sense to me in terms of gameplay. And admittedly, part of that was because from when I started out, I used it because I didn't want to have to keep everything in mind as much.
Yeah.
And I was worried about mixing stuff up or missing things. So if I just have everything there on the board, it's there. Even if I forget about something, I can still look and just see where it is. But that does result in the same reason why there's a lot of RPG games and such that I don't enjoy, because you have story and you have conversation and such, and then, now it's combat, and you go into a completely different graphical world with completely different mechanics, and you have a group of people on each side standing there waiting for you to tell them what to do. And
Yeah,
suddenly it's not a story anymore, it's a piece of button mashing.
Yeah, it can be, and specifically in that analogy, very immersion breaking, and that's kind of one of the points that I want to get into either now or later. That once you pull out that grid, you are definitely changing the process that your players think in. It's completely different process that they go from. So I guess might as well just go into that, kind of the things that I don't like about the grid system, because I think that what is inherently good about grids, I think is pretty obvious. I don't think I've ever have anybody ever not mentioned that it keeps everything in mind, keeps everybody on the same place. It has, if you're very much into the tactical gameplay, it can be very useful for that. If you want to get making sure that you're in the right square, your allies are in the right square. You also find that, like, I think inherently people who like flanking rules and are upset that 5e has that as a variant, they love grids. Like that almost goes hand in hand. I think that's a pretty good tell. But the biggest issue that I have with grids is the fact that it does completely change the way that your players are thinking, and most likely as a DM, you're changing your way of thinking is going in. It removes the kind of like the core of D&D gameplay is again that three-step process where we start with the DM describes a scene, the players describe what they want to do, the DM describes the result. And you could be forgiven for seeing it's like, well, that's basically the same in D&D combat, but it's not. You might feel slaved into well, you can only take these actions and you can only do them at this time. Whereas I just had a session last night where the whole session I specifically was like, no, I'm going to put no grids out and we're going to do everything theater of the mind. And I think my players did a much better job of just being in the situation rather than looking at tokens on a grid. And so, like, something that came up that, not that it wouldn't come up in grid play, but I think it's a lot less likely for character or players to think of it, was that they were going up against a huge creature, and the barbarian in the group was like, "Hey, I want to try to push him over," and I'm like, "Well, based on his size, you're not going to be able to do it. He's just so big, you're not going to be able to push him over." And the fighter, she was like, "Hey, can I charge with him to both be able to push him?" And I was like, I like that idea. So I basically took like half of the fighter's turn, added it to the barbarian's turn for them both to get their attack action off. And then when her turn came up in initiative, I was like, okay, go ahead and finish. You used your movement already. You used half of your attack for your action. Just finish that up. And then she proceeded to not only finish her attack, but then based on the situation at hand, use the action surge to finish it off. And we kind of described it kind of as a moving ballet. There was a lot more conversation and description of how things were going. Whereas on a grid, I don't think that becomes inherent to it. What do you think about all that?
I agree completely that is what I want. That is the kind of stuff I want to be able to GM and to play. I want to be able to say I want to do this, and rather than having the numbers out there in front of me telling me, nope, I'm 5 feet too far off, I can't walk that far. Having the GM say, yeah, that works. Let's try it. Let's roll for it. That is what I want. But the problems I have, and some of them would be how to put this right. Being able to run fully with Theater of the Mind requires certain things. One, it requires a GM that describes things in a manner that all the players feel that they fully understand all the parameters of the situation. Well, not all, but enough of the parameters of the situation.
I'll write down all your points and we'll tackle each one individually. So
yeah, sure. There's the pressure on the GM to be able to convey sufficiently, and there's the pressure on the players to be able to visualize and think these things. And this is not to say that it's something you should. There are certainly a lot of players that just want the mechanical stuff, and they just want they aren't necessarily interested in the whole dynamic stuff, the more dynamic stuff. And that is a question of what kind of a group do you have, what kind of players are you dealing with, of course. But there is also the question of is this what the players want? And well, for one, this puts a pressure on both sides to be able to use the situation properly, whilst there is a larger symmetry of information in a grid map. This does still limit the whole mechanical element, but there is a bigger symmetry of information. Even though the DM there are still, of course, things the DM knows and should know that the party shouldn't. But at least the players, and again, this is also about trust between players and GMs, that the players feel like the GM is giving them the benefit of the doubt, so to speak.
Yeah, and
that,
I think
go on.
I think that's probably the most important point, is that there needs to be trust between the DM and players. But as you've probably heard me argue, I don't think you play high level D&D. And when I say that, I don't mean like mechanical high level. I mean at your table, things running at really peak efficiency and being the most enjoyable that they can. I don't think you can get to high level D&D without having trust at the table between all parties. I don't think it can happen, because there's so much that's required in that.
That is true, but there is also a learning curve in all things, and at a lower stage, people are going to be uncertain. Either the GM is, or the players, or both of them. And at that stage, having a grid and having everything out there can be very. It can be comforting to know
Yeah.
that you have the stuff laid out in front of you, and but
Yeah. And I think that's
this is also the reasons why, at the same time, that is also the reasons why I'm not a fan of, say, Pathfinder, because there's rules for it seems to be rules for everything, and it all becomes a question of, okay, what does the book say rather than what do I want.
yeah. And I think that's important to discuss or rather to go back over the idea, because I don't think we posited a goal. And the goal that, at least in my mind, is to play D&D at that high tier where you're getting maximum enjoyment out of it. And I will submit that probably is different from some people, but I do believe to a core that the strengths of tabletop role playing games, they lie in specific realms, and that I think the key way to describe that is that it is a game unlike any other because there is no coded limitation in it. Uh, Board games, tabletop war games, they have inherent limitations in their quote unquote coding. The way that they are written, you can't, I can't describe my Space Marine when I'm playing 40K as leaping over. Like, I guess I can, but there's no benefit to it, and that's not really
It would be a homebrew,
yeah,
basically.
exactly. And I think the mindset that you're in for a game like that would not fit. That's not a good fit for it to be like, my Space Marine flips forward, goes in, starts cutting. You don't have that breadth and that just wide creative flow. And board games are the same way. They've created this pen, this arena for you to play in based on their rules. And I have 200 plus board games, so I get, like, I love that aspect. That's why I play board games, because I want to be corralled in this arena based on what the designer said, and said you will have fun with these exact parameters. Video games, to a point, are a little bit more open than war games and board games, but they're still limited by their code. In the Mass Effect games, it feels like there's a lot of choices. It feels like there's open, or really any of these open world games, more like. But ultimately, you can't do anything because it's limited by its code. Whereas in D&D and tabletop games, they don't have that limitation. It's limited by your creativity and your DM's creativity, and I think ultimately that is their strength.
At the same time, it is, again, limited by your and your players' creativity, and that is also a potential weakness depending on who you're dealing with and
Yeah.
what their approach is.
So in this, I guess we'll give the caveat. This is the goal of this conversation, is not to say this is the best fit for every group. My goal is to say that if your group is firing on efficiency and you guys can build skill to this level, this is what I think right now, because still working through all this, probably will work through this for the rest of my life, that right now this is where I get my maximum enjoyment, because I feel that I have a skill level and my players have a skill level that really allow us to use that core at the center of tabletop, or that creativity is limitless. I think that's where we're at, and so for that, it needs the trust that we're talking about. So to get into the specific points that we were talking about, so the description, you're talking about how the DM has to, when you have the grid, there's a lot less description that needs to go into it, because everything's there. It saves time. When you get to your turn, you see everything that's there. You've done this, and I think while this saves time, I think it brings with it its own problems inherent. I think it's an easy out for players to no longer pay attention when it's not their turn, and it's almost like junk food for the mind, where they don't actually have to put any effort in for it to just happen. Like, the tokens will move, everything will be there. So effectively, they can get through the entire encounter without putting any mental effort in, other than attack action, I cast the spell. it becomes this very much if then else statements instead of being a creative endeavor. What do you think about that?
It is true that it's about a creative endeavor, and that is also what I want to encourage in my games. And as I mentioned, I've in my prior campaigns, I've always had a grid and such, but I've also tried to encourage that, like, if you say that your character swings their sword at someone's kneecaps, that might affect their movement speed and things like that, because I want to have that flexibility. But yeah, I want to get into using theater of the mind, but I haven't really taken the step over to really doing it. And I don't know if it's just me being worried I'm gonna forget stuff, or if it's just that I get too stuck in that I've just gotten into a habit, and I feel like because I don't really use Roll20 anymore, but back when I did, I really loved the ability to add music and to add pictures and backgrounds, and I want to add these other things around. And in that case, such a scenario, a battle map seems completely logical. It seems to just be another part of the experience, when it's really what it is a step towards mechanics, away from the whole immersions that I'm trying to build with the other parts. But
so
yeah.
you said something that kind of caught into my mind. You were, and I think this is the perfect red herring, and I'm glad you brought me to it, which is you said, like, you want it to be open for, like, creative actions where if you tag somebody's legs, it has an effect. And and while that inherently sounds interesting, I think that's where that mindset is where we get bogged down, and it makes the game worse. And we're gonna go down the rabbit hole with that. Okay.
Yeah, it's the attempt of trying to take something abstract and trying to make it mechanical. But when you make it mechanical, it's no longer it's gone from being something flexible to just being another rule, and at that point you've bolted something on there that doesn't necessarily fit.
Exactly. And I think it's nuance in everything. I think there are times when that's appropriate because it's good for the scene, but I think the rule of thumb in the situation should be, just because we're describing something creatively, it should not increase the amount of minutia that we're dealing with. For me, I think I look at the rules a little bit opposite to a lot of the ways that people look at the rules. People look at the rules as the way that you interact with the game. For me, the rules are the language that allows us to keep pace when we're in game. So when I say, I'm swinging my weapon, and I give this verbose, 30 to 45 second description of the attack, what I want inherently for my DM to understand is that all I'm doing is taking the attack action in the book. You know what those rules are. We don't need to discuss it at all. There's not a single point that we should be discussing what that attack action is, because we all both know we have a common language. But I don't have to spend any resources in my brain to convey that to you. I can spend all my resources describing this interesting scene. I can weave the words around it so that we can have a better time in this joint story that we're creating together.
Yeah, when you're talking about a car ride, you don't have to explain how a carburetor functions.
Exactly. Like, that would be rough, that every time I get into the car, you're like, this is this point, this is... And that's what I feel like we get into when we get into D&D combat, where I feel like we have this book that we've all pre-read, and we should all have the same language, but we all rehash it every time that we go into it. It's like, we're in this dangerous territory where this is something that maybe I haven't gone as deep as I would like to, and I'm not as firm on it, so I don't have the right language. So I keep having this knee-jerk reaction to be like, well, it's all based on opinion. It's what people want. But at some point, we have to dissect that and try, because it's not the goal. It's not about the goal of, okay, well, we found the best way to play D&D. It's over. It's about it's about dissecting it so that we can understand why we do things.
Mm.
And if we do that, not only will our game be better, but anybody participating in the conversation or observing the conversation might find out something that makes their game better. So at the end of the day,
Mm.
even if somebody in the comments says like, "Well, no, I prefer grids," it's like that's
Mm.
awesome. But this is what the point of the conversation is not to say that you're wrong, but it's to make your game better, because there might be this small thing that we say in this hour-long discussion that you're like, that's cool. And at the end of the day, we're all better for it because we challenged
Yeah.
each other.
Yeah, it's more important to make progress individually than it is to try and find some sort of universal truth.
Yes, and I think that's ultimate. And I'm going to speak sometimes in hyperbolics, and I'm going to speak in definitives, but it's a lack of the human language. And
Yeah,
I'm
and that is also a nature of the, shall we call it, dialectic? The
yes,
discussion back and forth.
yeah,
That we need to take stances on sides to be able to have them properly meet in the middle and
exactly.
see what happens.
And it's not that like I'm never going to use a grid. The likelihood of me never using a grid is probably pretty small, but I'm endeavoring to reduce it because I firmly believe that D&D is at its best when it's a creative endeavor, not a tactical endeavor. And I know that might be a little bit of an explosive.
Yeah. But here's another point, though. One that has disadvantages on both sides and how you may or may not manage it. When there's, let's say theoretically, and this might never actually happen for you, but let's say theoretically that you have a party of 9 players, say, and you get into a fight, and to make a fight that is interesting and dynamic for 9 players, and it's a big consequential fight, how many goblins and orcs are you going to need to make that work? And how many numbers and how many people on both sides are you going to deal with? Are you either on theater of the mind going to try and make some sort of vague system where you sort of track the approximate amount of damage, but don't necessarily track all the individuals? Or are you going to go for a grid where you have too many tokens to manage?
Yeah, so to answer your question directly of like how I would deal with something like that, I would probably use something in the middle where I have models or tokens that represent everybody involved, but we're not talking about the minutia of specific distances or anything. I'm probably going to, and again, this is me trying to do it with no grid whatsoever. This is my realistic response to let's say we'll say 9 characters, 15 enemies. So we're talking about 24 or more kind of like dangling variables that we're dealing with just people. I'm probably going to throw out, because I have a menagerie of miniatures, I'm probably going to throw out a bunch of miniatures on the table and say, this is roughly where everybody's at. And you can push your stuff around, but we're gonna talk more along the lines of like, you're single turn from engaging them, or stuff like that, to keep the pace going and not worry about minutia. For me, this is the most realistic answer I have for you to avoid getting on the grid.
And my approach to stay on the grid would have been to group the creatures in segments, so to speak, and say this square here represents about 4 or 5 goblins, and this one represents 2 orcs and stuff like that. And then you just describe based on those factors. Some people have spoken about propagated the idea that you don't actually track individuals, but you rather just sort of track numbers and
almost
like you don't
an abstracted morale system.
Yeah, like you don't actually say how many orcs or goblins you're dealing with. You're just saying that there's a Q plural term here. I'm not sure which one, but then you sort of keep track of the health, and people keep attacking, and you just sort of track a main, like one big health bar, so to speak, and you just sort of describe how the group slowly
that's kind of like
goes down.
The idea of warfare rules, and making to where it's it's not specific amount of enemies. The Fantasy Flight Warhammer 40k system does really good. It's called I think it's actually called like swarm rules. Where if you're a space marine, you're dealing with sometimes a lot of hormagaunts or a lot of guardsmen or something like that. So it's the idea that that you can only attack one guy in the group at a time, but you're dealing damage to an entire group of them, but they act as a unit. So I gave you what I think is the most realistic response that just about anybody could do, but I'll give you what my ideal response to the situation is, and then how I do it when I'm at the table or when I'm at a VTT. And that is, I will not put a grid out. I will put no tokens or anything like that out. But what I endeavor to do is that, one, I get like, okay, what's roughly everybody's position? That may involve my party just more easily just drawing and saying, like, this is our initial position. I'm like, cool, we all have in our minds, but I don't think that's necessary either. I think it's just like, are you kind of away from everybody? Yeah, I'm a little bit back from everybody. Okay, so you're a little bit off to the, basically, Archer, I'm a little bit behind everybody. Cool. Rogue, I'm a little bit off from everybody. Cool. Everybody else, we're kind of like in a loose grouping. Cool. That's really all I need. I just need the idea of, and we need to kind of somewhat agree initially where everybody's roughly set up. It's not important the minutia on it. But from there, it can get a lot more loose because it allows for creativity. But this also relies on the trust that the DM is going to take everything you say in the best light possible. So if the Archer fails to mention that he's backpedaling, the DM might ask, be like, hey, are you backpedaling away from anybody that might be encroaching on you? Yeah, I'm doing that every time. Cool, thanks. Things like that. Just always take them in the best light. But what I do, so like, let's say I have 15 goblins coming for these people, I'll probably on my sheet, instead of like drawing it out, I always have character names and like their initiative order on my sheet in front of me. And let them deal, like if they need to know their initiative order ahead of time, I'll let them write down what it is. But for my notes, I always have their initiative order down. And I will put tally marks, like how many foes are engaged with each player. And I have the kind of the health numbers popping off of each individual note right there. And that keeps it in my mind. And ideally, every time that somebody takes an action, I describe an action that has already happened during the turn, because again, everything's simultaneous. So the way it looks is like, okay, as Rana fires his magic missile, you knock an arrow, sticking it into the hobgoblin's chest from across the road. So if you constantly are referring to other actions that are happening in the same round, but turns that happen prior to, it's much easier to keep things in everybody's mind, and players can actively participate in this. As Belig raises his maul to strike against the hobgoblin, I'll bring my sword in to stab the same foe. And that helps keep it in everybody's mind and keeps it a creative endeavor. Not only that, but you're forcing is such a harsh word, but you are engaging in other players' turns because you need to participate in what they're saying and what you hear, because that paints the picture and makes it more options available to you.
And that goes into, that whole thing also goes into the, when you're writing a narrative or a story or a book, you want to have your sentences connect. You don't want to have you don't want them to be a list of points. You want them to be a flow from one event to another, to one perspective to another. So that's maybe a unique technique I could try at some point, where as a GM, if I'm leading a theater of the mind fight, and a player says that they does something, okay, that player does that, next player does that, okay, so as that guy does that, you do that, and then you just between every time two people's actions, you tie them together.
Yeah, and there's also a couple benefits that come with it, doing it this way. So terrain. Terrain, when you're doing grids and stuff, can actually take a lot of time for DMs to figure out where each individual rock is and where trees are and all this stuff. Theater of the mind, the player just goes, is it reasonable that there would be a tree or a low bush near me? I'm like, yeah, totally. That's not unreasonable. You're on the road. You take a step off the road. There's something there. Okay, I'll give you light obscurement, or I'll give you half cover in this instance.
Yeah.
So
you don't have to answer the question, what level of cover is this stone?
Yeah, I just give you, because again, we already have that language already written. There's a paragraph written that if I say, hopefully your players have read the book, that there's a little bit of requirement. The language doesn't make sense if they don't know the language. But
Again, expectations on both parts, and
exactly, again, this is the ideal situation. This is what we're talking about. So when they say, is it reasonable that I could hide behind a tree? Yeah, I'll give you a half cover for that. They immediately know all the mechanisms that derive from that. We don't have to sit there and go, "Yep, that'll give you +2 to your AC, +2 to dexterity saving throws."
rather than being, how much cover does this stone give me? How about
Yes,
that one?
exactly.
What about this tree? Which
We're
one do I pick?
we're getting into wargaming territory.
Yeah,
We're in like 40K when you're setting out terrain on the table.
Suddenly we've gone from the world map to the map to the combat screen again.
Yeah, and so like all this, it's so funny because like the argument is that like, well, grids save time because you're describing less. It's like, well, yes and no, because you could also get into these minutia arguments. Well, like, wouldn't this be at this angle where it doesn't happen? And I found myself in those situations where it's just like, well, if I, does this give +2 over here? But if I'm standing like this, would it give us like? It's like, God, I don't want to talk about this. Like, I just want to go back to the cool swords and sorcery in my mind.
Yeah, and there's also, however, the risk of the other end. I mean, if we can just take the little happening that was back in the day with the ogre mound and Vidlin and the lightning bolt, if you remember.
Yeah,
because I at the time, and we have the benefit of hindsight, but at the time I was convinced I was conveying perfectly what I wanted, and I'm pretty sure you were convinced that you conveyed your response correctly. Which one of us didn't? Which one of us might have not been completely conveying is irrelevant. The fact is that there was a disconnect there where I asked, the way I asked it was, how many can I hit and also hit the big guy? And I don't remember exactly. I don't remember all the details, but basically anyway, the basics was that I thought I'd done more, and we had a bit of a discussion there, and I reacted in a way that I probably shouldn't have. But again, benefit of hindsight and all that.
Yeah. So I also see that kind of like where you're going with that. In Theater of the Mind, it's much more difficult for a player to make their case of like, well, shouldn't I be able to hit these three guys? Because it might have a different image in their mind, right, of what's going on. And again, that is, I guess you could say that's an inherent flaw in the Theater of the Mind system. But as a DM, I feel like when I'm in Theater of the Mind, because of that inherent flaw, I am much more often on the player's side in any position. Whereas in a grid, and maybe it's just me personally, but on a grid, I feel the exact opposite, where I am antagonistic to players trying to get the most out of a situation.
At that point, you're players on each side of a chessboard rather than two people trying to tell a story.
Yeah.
But there's also then it's important to leave the gaps and the such, so you can fill in the gaps with what you feel is reasonable and makes sense for the story. And there are in a grid map, there are things there, but you could argue maybe there's a bunch of barrels in a room, and you could say, well, what makes sense to be in these barrels, rather than on the theater of the mind scenario, the player would have to ask what stuff's in the room besides the door, the walls, and the people.
Yeah.
Unless you've already described in
but
a lot of detail.
I also think that gives a DM an out to where they can be initially less descriptive. So I've often seen it where players can get bored so like when they enter a room, they have to listen to sometimes 2 minutes of description of what the room looks like, and it's so hard to keep all of that in your mind. But if a fight breaks out in it and everybody's willing to be trustworthy, and a player asks, okay, so you mentioned that there were, shipping goods in here. Would it be reasonable that there's like barrels or something that I can hide behind? You're like, yeah. So it's almost counterintuitive, right? Like on a grid, you'd be like, well, I'd have all the information. An image is worth 1,000 words. Whereas in Theater of the Mind, I could just be like, well, we don't have all the information in your mind, but if you ask a question, oh, well, now you've created. I might, as a DM, never have thought to put barrels in the room, but because you suggested it, they're now in there for cover.
Yeah, a picture may speak 1,000 words, but a blank space can literally be filled with anything.
Exactly, and I found that a lot, where a player
There is, however, a fine line to walk between where you're either not describing things so that the players feel like they know what they're dealing with, or giving yourself enough gaps to fill in to make the narrative more interesting or more amusing or more just better in general.
Yeah, and that's why usually when I give a description of the room, it's a 30-second or less description. I give the rough overview, and then it's up to players for them. And then, we're kind of getting away from the combat thing, but I think it kind of fits in the same realm a little bit. But
yeah, it's in the same realm. Some people want grids for everything. Some people want only grids for most people that do use grids mostly just want them for combat, as far as I can tell, at least.
Yeah.
And then there's the people who don't want grids.
I find ultimately that players don't actually give a shit if what's in the room unless it's mechanically advantageous to them. So, like, I can describe tapestries and bookcases and the smell that's in here, and I try to keep that as condensed as possible, 30 seconds or less, on how to describe that. And I leave it up to, because I have more. I have paragraphs more in what's in that room. But I leave it up to the players to effectively engage with the content. If they want to, they can just walk right through the room.
And at that point, there's also the question of at what point, because you don't want to go over 30 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
That's at that point you're starting to lose people.
Well, it's just too much. It's too much for them to grasp onto.
Both in terms of concentration and in quantity.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, you don't want to be putting too many words into their ears. You don't want to. If you could say that you open a door and the room looks elegant.
Yeah.
That could mean so many things, though.
Yeah.
But no, and one character's definition of, and again, are we talking that is this the GM's definition of elegant? Is this all the individual characters' definition, or the players?
And I inherently think that 9 times out of 10, this difference is not actually a problem, because if often these ideas are not going to butt heads because it's not going to come up in contention, and everybody creates their own head in so the way I could put this in a way, have you ever watched a movie and the ending of the movie was so disappointing to you because you had built something up in your head that could never be, whether you consciously or subconsciously knew this, nothing could bring it to that point, or it was unreasonable to expect the directors, the writers, to be able to know what you think would have been the best reaction to the end of this movie?
Well, for one, I don't watch many movies, you know that. But there are series and shows where I have the shows that I have watched where I felt like the ending was, it just sort of went out on a. Well, it didn't go out in a way that felt like a real ending. Yeah, things just sort of stopped.
I think Theater of the Mind engages that exact problem in humans, the differences of two human psyches, and actually turns it into a boon, where you're allowing their imagination to make it the best for them, and as a majority of those things are not going to come in contention. They're probably going to think in their mind, they're like, oh, these trees with the leaves falling. DM might have never said that there are trees falling, but to them, this is an evocative scene.
Leaves falling, but now I'm pointing at words.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I apologize. But the idea, and I know I'm probably not explaining this well enough, but the idea is that unless it comes into contention, which most of the time it's not, you are making the experience better for everybody at the table because it's their imagination able to create the best idea in their own minds.
Yeah, it's as I mentioned, it's the question of the gaps, and how are they going to be filled, and like the mechanical, the very mechanical grid and such, it fits more with a system that is more like Pathfinder or older editions of D&D, because that is more mechanical with more rules by definition, far as I know.
Yeah,
and at that point,
I have reasons and theories to that, but yeah, I agree.
Not going to pretend to be super experienced in other editions. I've almost exclusively played 5e D&D, but but yeah, there's a difference. But there's a big difference between a DM that is expected to know the rules and a DM that is expected to convey an interesting series of events in a story.
Well, and also a
And
DM who is there to actually adjudicate said rules rather than have those rules espoused to them.
yeah, are we playing with the rules or are the rules playing us?
Yeah. And that's the age-old question that makes it difficult to have a lot of these conversations.
Yeah, but that's also what makes D&D so interesting, because it's such an intersection between mechanics and narratives and storytelling and such. There are plenty of people who do storytelling without any, like, I've done RP and such in forums and such where we literally had no rules at all, no holds barred, no nothing. And while it certainly encourages certain types of people and certain types of behavior, it can still be very interesting, but it has a tendency to, it does not have any form of consistency to it.
Yeah.
There is no overarching sense of symmetry to the whole thing. It's just plenty of voices back and forth.
Yeah, and it also lacks, because I've done my fair share of the same. It lacks a lot of commonality in language, whereas I think the mechanisms in D&D allow for that commonality of language, that you can abstract a lot of things and give it that interesting creative flourish to it. Again, we talk about like the attack action. If I just say I attack him, that is the same thing as if I take a 20-second description about what my attack looks like and then roll my die while I'm doing that.
Yeah. And someone somewhere is going to say, "Oh, just say you hit him. You're wasting my time. I want to get more turns in."
Yeah. And to kind of close this out on it, I also, my main point of why I think grids are ultimately like a red herring to what the strength of D&D is because I personally get my tactical benefits out of other mediums. So if I want something super toothy and tactical, one of my favorite genres of video games is turn-based tactical games on the grid. I love the Fire Emblem series. I love Advance Wars series. Wargroove just came out. I've been playing Into the Breach almost every day while I'm watching some of my series on YouTube. It's just Final Fantasy Tactics, even I love the advanced ones. I could go on forever, but I love this. I love that idea of tactical grid-based combat. But I scratch that itch in other places. D&D does not, for me, need to be that. D&D for me needs to be this creative process where we're generating a story together and having fun with my friends. I don't want to look at grids and numbers with them.
But let's say another theoretical though. If you have a GM that is uncertain and you have players that are not used to role playing or not used to these kinds of games, would you say that starting out with a grid and some minis or something would be at least a way to get going? And could it be used as a set of training wheels, so to speak?
Hopefully I will.
And some people will take massive problems with me referring to grid play as training wheels, but it's just for this example.
Yeah, and hopefully I'll curb some of that because what I say hopefully is not divisive. So I will hopefully never get to a point where I say nobody ever under any circumstance should use grids. Hopefully I never say that. Because honestly, there's so many variables. If you like grid combat, then by all means, man, go for it. That's awesome. But I personally would suggest to that said DM and those said players, hey, why don't you try working those theater of the mind muscles and get better at it? Like, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to have bad sessions. It's going to happen no matter what. But if your goal is to attain this high level of play that and you believe what I'm saying and you think what I'm saying is not garbage, then you want to start working those muscles as early as possible, not using something that's ultimately your plan is to get rid of it anyways. I think if you like grid combat and that's something that you're really into, then just fucking use the grid, man. Like I don't know. It's just maybe you and I have a different opinion on what we think high tier D&D is, and I can learn from you as much as you can learn from me, hopefully.
Yeah, like I lost the thing I was going to say. Let's see. We'll see if it comes back, but it is important. It is. Sorry.
Basically, I would not. To sum it up, I would not give the suggestion to use a system that I didn't believe helps you get to higher tier play.
Yeah, it's a question of acquired skills. Do you want to improve this one or the other one?
Yes.
Are you more interested in the tactical, mechanical stuff, or are you more interested in the narrative stuff? Yeah. And be willing to try. And as someone, I forget his name, but he's a gunsmith that I watch on YouTube a bit, and his first advice to anyone trying to learn that stuff is pick up a tool and start making mistakes.
Mm-hmm. And that's exactly the same thing I say about D&D, is when somebody says, well, because I always ask people, how long have you been in the hobby? And they'll say, like, year and a half, 4 years. I'm like, why haven't you DM'd yet? And they're like, well, I'm afraid. I don't know. It's list of reasons. None of them wrong. Like, you can give me all the reasons in the world, and that makes sense to me. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, I say, well, do you have an interest in being a DM? And very few people say no. And when they don't say no, I'm like, well, it's just you're not building your skill. Like, you're gonna make mistakes. Might as well start sooner rather than later, so you can start having a good time, if that's what you want to do.
And I mean, everyone has this vision of wanting to. In general, really, in anything, everyone has. If there's something someone really wants to do, they have this vision of, I want to do that specific thing, and I want to make this masterpiece or this perfect little system that is my own setting or world. But because we have this idea of something so perfect, and then we look at our first attempts and go, no, that's not what I had in here.
Yeah.
Therefore I cannot do this. But you have to build that, and you have to. It's like I don't know how many times I have adjusted things or changed stuff in my setting, the document I have for my D&D setting, and I'm still working on it and still have a lot of stuff that I want to adjust or change or improve or add more to. And you got to build it. You can't just want it to be there and then just never touch it.
Yeah. So hopefully we can leave you on that if your goal is that you want to do more theater of the mind, then start now. If your goal is that you want to make grid combat better,
guilty as charged.
Then But hopefully this was useful. I know we were a lot of different areas, and we probably said a lot of stuff that people are going to disagree with. But that's good. We can get better, and maybe we can change positions based on that. But ultimately, the goal for everybody involved and in this discussion is that we're taking people's arguments in the best light possible, seeing that they have the best interest in other people's minds, not to tell them that they're wrong, but in fact to make their game better. So hopefully you do the same in the comments.
Yeah. Always try to understand the other person or the other argument from the position of good intentions and benevolence, and work your way from there.
Yep. All right. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks, Viktor, for joining.
Thanks for having me on.